This episode contains material that might be triggering for some. If you need to stop the podcast at any time to take care of yourself, please do so.
If you need support, you can call the 24/7 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Dialectical behavior therapy was created in the 1980s by Marsha Linehan in Seattle, Washington.
Today, DBT is taught all over the world.
We're two therapists who believe everyone can benefit from DBT skills.
I'm Kate.
I'm Michelle.
And this is DBT and Me.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode.
Hi, everyone.
So, today's episode is going to be a little bit different, in as much as it has nothing to do with DBT.
Yep.
Nothing to do with it. Nothing we are pulling from here is from any DBT skill, any DBT handout, but early on in Michelle and mine's co-teaching career, when we were doing interpersonal effectiveness and we were asking other people anything else that you'd like us to talk about or cover or whatever, right? Asking for suggestions. And almost unanimously, people always said, boundaries! We want to know more about boundaries! How to set them, how to tolerate them, what they are, what healthy ones are, all this stuff. So, over the last few years, Michelle and I have developed a bit of a curriculum for covering it. And so that's mostly what we're going to go into today, is information about, what boundaries are, how to set them, what different types of boundaries people have, and what that looks like. I would also say, it's funny, Michelle, I'm sure, always loves it when I add stuff after we've done our little debrief, once we've actually started recording. That's my best feature.
I've done it many times.
But I think it would, I don't even know where we ought to put it in there, but I think maybe in the how to do it section as well, but how to tolerate it, right? It can, because as hard as it is to set boundaries, especially if we haven't been used to them much in life, tolerating other people setting boundaries can be really hard as well. I know I've certainly experienced that, having been raised in a family where boundaries weren't so much a thing. So anyway, I think that could be worth speaking to for a minute or two. But that's all boundaries all the time. That's what we're up to today. And I was telling Michelle, I was like, I think this one's also going to be a long one, because there's a lot to say on the subject, and they're so important.
Yeah, this is a really important episode.
Yeah, really important topic, really hard topic. And so, hopefully you find stuff to take away from today. More information, and maybe ideally feeling a little bit more empowered to set and hold your boundaries. So,
yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna get it going. We're talking about boundaries in a few different ways today. So the first thing that we're gonna get into is, because I keep wanting to say different types of boundaries.
Oh, I know, right? But types means different things, right?
Yeah, types means different things. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is how strong of boundaries someone has. That's the best way I can think of to put it. Some people have really, really, really strong boundaries to a fault, and some people have no boundaries
to a fault.
to a fault. And then there's this healthy middle ground place. And so there's three different things that we're going to talk about. It's similar, but not to when we talked about emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind a little bit.
I like that.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about these three different types types, but like kinds of boundaries that people can have.
Strengths.
The strengths of boundaries, yeah.
Your strengths. Though I guess I realized we probably also ought to define exactly what a boundary is in general.
This is important too. So this worksheet that we're using, which is a great worksheet from therapistaid.com, we love how this worksheet talks about boundaries. So we're going to post it for you guys. But the way that they define boundaries, they say personal boundaries are the limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships. A person with healthy boundaries can say no to others when they want to, but they are also comfortable opening themselves up to intimacy and close relationships. So that's what we're talking about. Boundaries are the limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships.
Nice. That's very succinct. I like it.
Very succinct. I know. I like that. Imagine if you and I tried to define boundaries, just freewheeling on our own.
Just off the cuff.
Right.
Oh, we'd ramble.
I mean, we could do it, but it'd be super rambly and drawn out. So I'm going to talk about these 3 different strengths of boundaries that people can have. So the first one, which is when someone has too strong a boundaries, is having rigid boundaries. So what does that mean if someone has rigid boundaries? Basically, the way that they define it on this sheet is these people who have rigid boundaries avoid intimacy in close relationships. They're unlikely to ask for help. They don't really have a lot of close relationships because they don't let people get very close to them. They can be very protective of their personal information, and they can seem detached, cut off, cold a little bit when they're interacting with other people. And they keep people at a distance because they don't want to be rejected. So Kate and I sometimes, when we teach this and we have a whiteboard, someone with rigid boundaries is like somebody in a house that has no doors. like a very strong, I don't know, brick, stone house, something like that. Nobody's coming into that house. And also, they're not leaving that house either. So when you have rigid boundaries, you don't want to let people get close to you, and you're not allowing yourself to get close to other people either.
Isolating.
Yeah, very isolating. So someone who has rigid boundaries, they're basically, to really generalize here, but they're trying not to get hurt a lot of the time. If you don't let people in, then no one can hurt you, kind of an idea. But it's keeping out people who could be healthy people too. Everyone's kept at a distance, more or less, when you have boundaries that are too rigid. So some people have boundaries like that. And then if we swing the totally other way, there are people who have porous boundaries. So someone with porous boundaries, they overshare information about themselves. They have a really hard time saying no. They can get over-involved with other people's problems and become dependent on the opinions of others to basically dictate or determine what choices they themselves make. They can be accepting of abuse or disrespect, not view it as maybe as big of a problem as it is. And they fear that they could be rejected if they don't do what other people want from them. Now, with both of these lists, right, with the rigid boundaries list and this porous boundaries list, someone may not check every single one of those boxes, but you're going to see some general trends. Yeah. Cheeks. Somebody who probably checks at least 3 or 4 of those if they have porous boundaries, generally speaking. So with someone who has porous boundaries, as I was just talking about with the rigid person who lives in a house that has no door, someone with porous boundaries, they don't even, I don't know, they don't have anything around them.
I was gonna say they don't close their doors, or their doors are off the hinges. Yeah, that could be another
way to think of it. Yeah, they don't close their door, right? They have
every door opening. And every window is open.
yeah. Anyone could come in at any time, basically. So this can be a recipe for getting hurt in various ways. Emotionally hurt, physically hurt. If you're just this open book that's letting in everyone and everything. And I think it's something, and Kate, you can tell me your thoughts on this too, because I'm really curious to hear your take on it. Sometimes with rigid boundaries, I think people can really understand why someone might get to that point where they have rigid boundaries of like, oh, That person was probably hurt at some point in their life, and bam, they erected these walls around them so that they'd never get hurt again. Okay, that makes sense. I can see that. But I think people can get a little stumped with why someone would have porous boundaries. Like, where does that come from that people have that way? So I'll share a couple things where I see it coming from. But I'm curious to know if you have anything to tack on. So that, a lot of this can very much come from what we had modeled for us in childhood. What kinds of boundaries did your parents have with people in their lives or with you as their child? Did they have extremely rigid boundaries, or did they have more of these porous boundaries where, maybe you saw them establish very close relationships with people they barely knew? Maybe they let in people very indiscriminately, like everyone was okay to come over to your house. Maybe they just moved through the world in kind of this naive, trusting sort of way, and they just didn't ever really say no to people. That can be a big place that it comes from. It's just what you see your parents doing. Then you may grow up to do much the same thing. Other times, I think another reason why porous boundaries can form is because even though with rigid boundaries, right, you get hurt in some way and you're like, I'm never, ever getting hurt again. Sometimes with porous boundaries, if you get hurt, there can sometimes be this thing that almost happens where, like, yes, someone hurt you in some way, but you can very much be looking to get rescued or have other people, you want to bring people maybe close to you so that you can rebuild, in a sense, like being connected to other people after maybe someone who was close to you like fucked all that up and hurt you. That's just kind of like, well, I want people back. I want people close to me. If I have enough people close to me that drowns out this bad thing that happened. It can go that way too sometimes. I don't know. What are your thoughts so far on rigid and porous boundaries, or why they happen and occur?
Well, for the, first of all, absolutely the what's modeled, right, is a huge thing, right? I may or may not have had someone in my life raising me, who would literally say that setting boundaries is mean. It is an act of cruelty, shows that you don't like someone, shows that you don't love someone, shows that you don't, trust that person, right? So, what is the message? What are not only the modeling, but maybe the direct messages that you receive around boundaries? Another thing that I think can pretty easily cause porous boundaries is childhood abuse.
Yeah. This
idea that, first of all, that making other people happy is your only road to safety.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this idea of taking care of other people's problem, having a hard time saying no, looking at other people's opinions of yourself to be the only measure of your worth, right? This can be stuff that is caused by, abuse. I would say childhood, but it could also happen later on, in adulthood. The other thing that can happen via abuse is that whatever your parents or whatever were modeling, the expectation of you, the thing you were raised with, was that you don't get boundaries, right? You don't get privacy. You don't get to keep, quote unquote, secrets. You don't get to say no, right? So I think there's so many different ways in which our environments in our early lives shape us around boundaries. Rigid boundaries, as you were saying, can often be caused by having been hurt. They can also be caused by watching people be hurt, right? I see my mom get hurt over and over again, so I'm never gonna be like that.
Yeah, very true.
Right? So it doesn't even have to be something that happened to you. It can be something you witnessed in your environment. It can also be, I like that it was talked about rejection, because I don't think a lot of people think of that. People, I think, often see rigid boundaries as I don't know, haughty or, looking down at people, right? I'm better than you. But it can also come from extreme or extraordinary lack of, not self-respect, but being insecure. Like a lot of insecurities can also drive rigid boundaries. If no one knows what's in here, they won't know what I'm lacking.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas with porous boundaries, I think it is a look here, let me show you everything that I am and just pray that you take it. that it's liked, right? Like, here is my everything.
Yeah.
Please love me. Please love me. Right. Kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know, that dovetails into a lot of what you were saying, but
yeah, no, great thoughts. Thank you. So finally, then we get to healthy boundaries. Yay. So someone with healthy boundaries values their own opinions, and harkening back to FAST, isn't going to compromise their values for others. So that was the S in FAST. The big piece of the FAST was sticking to your values. So someone with healthy boundaries is able to do that. They share personal information in an appropriate way. So we were talking about this a little bit with how to make friends in that episode of you want to make sure you're not over or under sharing. So someone with healthy boundaries can strike that balance of knowing what the right amount is to share, depending on the person and the context they find themselves in. Someone with healthy boundaries also knows what their wants and needs are, and they can communicate those to other people.
Oh, that's so hard.
It's so hard. So they can ask for help, or they can use Dear Man, right, to make requests of people when they would like something from them. And Kate, you touched on this, I think, a little bit with boundaries. Sometimes it's not just about us figuring out how to set them, but it's figuring out how to accept them when other people set them with us.
Yep.
That's the flip side of this. And someone with healthy boundaries is able to accept it when other people say no to them. And they can accept and respect other people's boundaries. So someone with healthy boundaries, they have, if we go with the house metaphor again, they live in a house where they have a door that can close and can lock. And sometimes they know when to open that door to let people in, or when to keep it closed to keep people out. They are able to discern how much and who to let in and who to not allow in, basically. So compared to the person with rigid boundaries who has no door, the person with the porous boundaries whose door is flung wide open for all the world all the time. The person with healthy boundaries sometimes has their front door open, and sometimes, excuse me, oh, we just ate lunch. Excuse me. Sometimes has their front door open and sometimes has their door shut. And they're able to determine what is best for them. So, with healthy boundaries, like with some of the other ones, someone may have healthy boundaries and not be able to check all of these boxes. I mean, it's 5 criteria, but those are 5 big criteria to be able to get to. So maybe you have 1 or 2 of those down, and that's great. And maybe there's 1 or 2 from the other boxes that you're also working on. And Kate's going to talk about this in a moment, like with how these different boundaries might show up in different situations and settings that we find ourselves in. But I also think of it for those of you out there who know anything about attachment style. There's a lot of research out there about how we form attachments in childhood, early childhood, like 0 to 3 years old. How we form attachments specifically with our mothers, that affects the attachment that we form in adulthood when we're entering romantic relationships in particular. So there's tons of stuff out there about adult attachment styles if you want to Google it and learn more. But somebody who has an avoidant attachment style probably has some rigid boundaries. Someone with porous boundaries has an anxious attachment style, and someone with healthy boundaries has a secure attachment style. So there's a lot of crossover there with the research on attachment as well. But we're going to be referring to these terms probably throughout the episode today about rigid boundaries, porous boundaries, and healthy boundaries. So it's most important right at the beginning to go over what those are, what the defining characteristics are of each one.
I like it. Also, I thought your excuse me is funny because I'm always terrified that I'm going to have to sneeze.
Oh, yeah.
Try and choke back sneezes. But there's no way for me to mute myself with this microphone.
While we've been podcasting.
Yeah, but I sneeze loud.
Everyone will understand, Kate, I'm sure.
Anyway, all right.
If
So again, without talking too specifically, we'll get into more specific stuff in a couple of minutes. But, Michelle was talking about all these different types of boundaries, the rigid, the porous, the healthy, and maybe you were sitting there and being like, yes, and yes, and that was puzzling to you. So, the truth of the matter is, it's rare for anyone to have the same strength of boundary in every setting in their life, right? The way that the handout puts it, which I like, somebody might have healthy boundaries at work, more porous boundaries in romantic relationships, and maybe more rigid or a mix of different types of boundaries with the different members of their family, right? So if you found a bit of yourself in each one of the different categories that Michelle was describing, that's normal, right? That's pretty normal, where we each have our own unique set of strengths and weaknesses. Family is often, I think, the hardest one around boundary setting to be healthy. If you weren't raised with healthy boundaries in your family, it can be really hard to start establishing them there. But, it's okay. If you look at that, it's not a way to, shame yourself or other things. If you're just like, oh yeah, I do pretty well in these arenas of my life having healthy boundaries, but in this one, not so much, right? But appreciate yourself, congratulate yourself for the places you're doing great, and just see the other one as like, oh, this is a place I can look at something. This is a place I can work on. What is getting in my way of having healthy boundaries in this situation? And so it's a signpost. It's a guide marker, right? So that you can know where to put your focus and energy around boundary settings. That being said, speaking of different contexts, not only is the strength of the boundaries you have sort of naturally going to be different in different settings, but different boundaries are more or less appropriate in different settings as well, right? If you think you're out with a group of friends, it's probably more okay to have a little bit more porous boundaries, right? You can have that door open a little bit more, be more vulnerable, be, more interdependent with these people, things like that, because it's a safe environment where you're known and where things are pretty all right. And very different expectations for boundaries, in your workplace. Don't tell that dirty joke there, right? that was fine at the bar with friends last night, but not so much in the morning meeting at work, right? So, whatever your inclinations are, and maybe they fit and maybe they're a mismatch, but it's also good to kind of clue into what's appropriate in that setting, right? What are the expectations of you? What expectations do you have of the others in any given setting? And last, but certainly not least, culture matters.
Yep.
Right? I know that we have international listeners, and speaking of, I think it'd be fascinating if anybody wants to post in the Facebook group or email us about us. I'd love to hear some of the differences about what boundaries are seen as appropriate or inappropriate in your cultures. But right? Because I certainly don't know enough, but I do know that broadly, there are some cultures where you're supposed to remain very stoic, right? This idea of quiet, of calm, of stoicism, of relying on the intellect, that is the way you're supposed to move through the world. And in other cultures, big, flamboyant, big expressions of emotions are encouraged, right? Expected. And not just in private, right? In public, in all sorts of different situations, right? For some people, for some cultures, some stuff is considered very private, while in other cultures it's perfectly fine to have it be completely public. So be mindful of who you are, who the people around you are, where there might be mismatches. And just, does that save you from all social gaffes? No. But at least it might help you understand where they're coming from and help you and that other person explain the mismatch, right? If you have these terms of, this is totally okay here. Help me understand better why, this was what your thoughts are on this, or how your culture responds to this, or stuff like that. It's a place for dialogue and for mindfulness, I guess is what I would say. Any thoughts to add on those ideas, Michelle?
Not a whole lot. I think your point is really interesting that there are, just culturally some cultures where the boundaries are more rigid and some cultures
Yep.
where the boundaries are more porous. So depending on what type of boundaries you have can largely be a product of the culture that you grew up in. And that if you go to another culture, you may feel a little out of place. Did I say another culture? Another country.
Same idea, but also, I
Yeah.
guess that's the, I had a thought, don't go away. Culture, different things are appropriate. So we're using those terms of, they might be more rigid or they might be more porous, but
those might be considered the healthy boundaries
Healthy,
where you
exactly.
are. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like the rigid
That's where I was going.
boundaries, it may look rigid, but that's considered healthy within that
Yeah, the bar
cultural norm.
moves, I guess, right?
Mhm.
What you're shooting for is healthy can shift culturally. Often does shift culturally. Good. That's what I was, good point.
Totally. Okay, so now we're going to get into the different types of boundaries. Kinds of boundaries, types of boundaries, I guess it is. So there are 6 different types of boundaries that we're going to talk about, and you might be like, what? 6? Because I had not really thought about how there were this many different types of boundaries before Kate and I found this worksheet. So there's a lot of different types of boundaries that exist. And as Kate was just naming really nicely, you may find it very easy to set healthy boundaries in some of these domains, and then in other domains that may be really challenging for you. So I'm of the belief that pretty much none of us always set healthy boundaries with all these different types.
Good Lord, no, that'd be so much.
Yeah, that's so much. So just be really kind to yourself as we're going through this list of noticing which ones come maybe more easily for you to set healthy boundaries and which ones you may struggle with a little bit more. And that's completely normal to struggle in at least one of these areas with setting boundaries. So the first one that I'm going to talk about, which I would say might be the most common or cliche type of boundary that people might think of, I'm going to talk about physical boundaries. So when we say physical boundaries, what we mean is boundaries related to personal space and physical touch. And specifically, because we're going to talk about sexual boundaries in a little while. So touch that is not sexual in nature. Other kinds of physical touch is what we're referring to with physical boundaries. So when you do have healthy physical boundaries, you're going to be aware of what's appropriate and what's not in various settings for different types of touch. What might be an okay touch when you are, I'm going to do a really obvious one, kind of touch that you are okay receiving from your partner, maybe a kind of touch that you are not okay receiving from your boss. Right? To just be super black and white and really obvious here. So you're able to recognize what kinds of physical touch feel comfortable for you, what kinds of physical touch you feel okay receiving, and what kinds of physical touch feel like a boundary violation to you and make you feel uncomfortable. And that is going to depend maybe on the context that you're in and the type of relationship that you have. So one example that I'll give here is being a dancer. Dance is a very physical art form, especially ballet. You are dancing with, females have male partners and vice versa. Like you are consistently dancing with someone of the opposite sex. And you are getting lifted and all of this stuff. You're being touched a lot when you're dancing with someone. And sometimes, to be too explicit here, but especially with overhead lifts, like when the man would be lifting the woman over his head, his hands kind of slide up. It just happens. Totally accidental, right? This is just what happens when you're being lifted. And it was something where in that context, especially like I would know, I'll say the boys, I stopped dancing when I was 17. So the boys that I was dancing with, I would know them. I knew what context it was in. You know, and I remember like my mom watching part of class and she's like, does that ever make you, and I'm like, no, it literally doesn't make me feel uncomfortable at all. This is just what happens when you're dancing with someone. I would know what kinds of touch would feel inappropriate and what kinds of touch would not. So a lot of it comes down to you knowing what feels right for you, which is going to be unique to everyone in terms of ways you are comfortable being touched and not comfortable being touched. A lot of it comes down to the context that you're in and what's appropriate or not appropriate for that context. Because if I was just walking down the street and I was touched in the way that I was in the dance classroom, absolutely not. That would not be okay. So it's having this idea of, you know, people talk about our physical bubble that we have a lot. And as somebody in your bubble, it's knowing what your bubble is and being able to let people know if they are entering your bubble and you would like them to not enter your bubble. And physical boundaries also relates to like physical spaces. So personal spaces like your bedroom. It doesn't relate to belongings. That's also another type of boundary we're going to talk about, but it can also be about, the physical space that you're inhabiting and not wanting people to enter that space that you're in either. Even if they are in no way touching you, not wanting them to come into the physical space that you're in also. So those are
like whether
physical
you're
boundaries.
in it or not, like someone going through your room when you're not home or something would be the thing.
Totally.
The only other thing I was thinking about is that you can have different physical boundaries even with the same person, but in different contexts. So like, I know this is a little bit more sexual, but like some people are very uncomfortable with public displays of affection, right? Even if it's not excruciatingly, sexual, but it's okay for you to kiss me when we're at home, but don't do it when we're out, right? Like, so it's okay to have very context dependent boundaries, even with the same person.
Yep. Or with different people who occupy like the same role, like with different coworkers.
Sure.
Some coworkers, you might feel comfortable giving them a hug as a greeting. Other coworkers, you would not want to receive a hug from them or give a hug. So yeah, it can vary with people who serve the same function in your life too. What sense. Physical boundaries you have.
All right. On to the next?
Yes. Let's go.
On to the next. So I'm going to start with talking about intellectual boundaries, which of all of these might have been the one that I was the least aware of, least cognizant of before I ever saw this worksheet. I remember seeing this and just being like,
what are those?
What? Yeah, I don't understand. But hilariously, I would actually say that in some of our guidelines for the group that Michelle and I run, we actually cover this in saying you don't have to agree with anyone, but everyone's opinions need to be respected, right? And that, I think, is a big part of the idea of intellectual boundaries. This refers to things like thoughts and ideas, right? So, I don't know, this is also context dependent. So what is appropriate here, right now, or the other place? I see my father with some regular basis, and he and I disagree on a lot of things, especially politics. That's a big one where my dad and I disagree. But we know each other very well. Like, we know what we can and can't do, and we will get into very intensive debates about this stuff, right? But we know each other. We know the space we're in. We're in private in his home, and so it's a very relationship and space dependent thing. I would probably not have those same kind of debates with him if we were at a party, right? Like, I don't necessarily want to reveal that dynamic of our relationship to other people, right? Or if it was someone I just met at a party, I also might not choose to get into that kind of debate with them. I don't know how comfortable they are with someone disagreeing with them vehemently. There's the reason, don't talk about money, religion, or politics, right? Those are sort of rules a lot of people have, because those tend to be very divisive subjects. So a lot of what these intellectual boundaries refer to is, how do I interact with other people's thoughts and ideas, and how do other people interact with my thoughts and ideas? And this, again, is, I think we're going to end up saying this for all of them, but it bears repeating 6 times, so why not? Right? Like, this is going to depend on the person and the context over and over and over again, right? So even the same person in different contexts, things are going to be different, and different contexts are probably just always going to be different no matter what. The ways that some of these ways that intellectual boundaries can be violated is when someone dismisses your thoughts or ideas outright, or if they belittle them, right? Again, no one has to agree with anybody else. Right? I don't know, what is it? My family always said opinions are like assholes. Everybody has them. Right? But it doesn't mean you have to like them. But there's a difference between disagreeing with someone and just shitting on them.
Yeah, like
right?
disrespecting them.
Disrespecting them, right? And that's the line you want to look for yourself and in how you interact with others, right? Am I interacting with this idea, and am I doing it in a respectful way or not? What is another thing I think of? I don't know. There's a difference between I don't like that idea and that's stupid, right? Like, or I disagree with you, or you're just fucking wrong, right? Like, you can even get similar messages across, but in a way that shows that you are respecting that other human being and their autonomy and their agency, right? And their ability to, and the fact that they have a different life experience, a different way of getting to this time and place than you did. So yeah, it's I think sometimes a little bit more amorphous than maybe physical boundaries are. Physical boundaries are like, here is my body, here is my space.
Yeah, you can either touch me in this way, or I do not want you to touch me in this way. Yeah,
like they're sort of concrete, sort of discrete things, and intellectual boundaries are a little bit more ephemeral. But it's to an extent. I keep tapping my own chest, which is none of you can see this, but I think there's that, we've all felt that. We've felt it sometime, somewhere in your life, someone violated this, right? You put forward, I don't know, at work, you put forward an idea in a meeting and it was dismissed out of hand without being considered. Maybe just because you were new, or just because you were whatever, fill in the blank here for whatever role you were, right? Like, people just didn't listen to you. Or, teachers disregarded you, right? So oftentimes this can be people in power not acknowledging you as a person with value. Or maybe it was a partner or a friend who laughed at a thing that you said, or, made fun of you for it. Like, there's this feeling, right? This is why I keep touching my own chest. There's this feeling when someone is invading your intellectual boundaries, is violating them. And it, to me, has always felt kind of gross. I guess what's sort of interesting about it is someone interacting with your ideas, to me, can feel very much like someone crossing a physical boundary if it's being done wrong, right? If it's being violated. It feels a similar kind of slimy, gross, hurtful. And often is a place where we struggle because of people in power, right? Like, it's harder to set physical boundaries with people who have leverage or have power over you. This is why we have so much things about, I guess this is tripping over into sexual again, but like workplace harassment and things like that. And the same thing can be said for intellectual boundaries. This is hard enough between, peers or close relationships, but especially hard to maintain, I think, in the face of people who have power over you in some fashion or another. So, anything to add about intellectual boundaries, Michelle?
No, I think you covered it really well.
Okay.
So similar to intellectual boundaries, right? Because intellectual boundaries deal with thoughts and ideas and opinions and that kind of a thing. The next type of boundaries we're going to talk about are emotional boundaries. So telling the difference between an intellectual boundary being crossed and an emotional boundary being crossed, yeah, they're both kind of this intangible thing. There's not a physical literal line that someone crosses, but really emotional boundaries are, about a person's feelings and their emotional state. So, setting boundaries in this way can include a few different things. Like, it can really be about one of the things we talked about in the episode around making friends, of like knowing how much to self-disclose, how much to share about yourself, your personal experiences, And that falls under emotional boundaries, right? Intellectual boundaries is, kind of like, oh, I have this idea. I have I think this way about this thing. Emotional is more talking personally about yourself, is maybe how I would differentiate between the two. Your own life experiences, who you are, and being able to have healthy emotional boundaries is about knowing when and how much to share that with another person. And if your emotional boundaries are being violated, I think that could look a few different ways. One might be someone sharing too much about themselves with you. That's one way it can look. The other way it might look is that if you are sharing about yourself personally, that's a pretty vulnerable thing to do, and it can look like people disrespecting that, taking that information and turning it against you. The biggest way that I think of it showing up, honestly, is like being bullied.
Oh, yeah. Or invalidated, stuff like that.
Yeah, invalidated, not listened to, not being heard. And again, this is different than somebody telling you, that they don't have time or the capacity to hear what you have to say. It's not that. It's somebody purposefully ignoring or disregarding what you're saying with the intention of, I guess, hurting you is the best way I can think of to put it.
I like the bullying thing because I think about like boys being to like, don't be a sissy, like boys don't cry, right? That kind of thing I would say is definitely a way of violating emotional boundaries, right? Like your emotion is stupid and inappropriate. Like if that message is getting given to you in any way.
Yep. Yeah. And I've worked with lots of clients who were given messages like that early in life, by family members or whoever it was, that like expressing emotions was not allowed or okay. And this is where I think some of those rigid boundaries can come up, where people are like, I'm just not going to show any emotions about anything because it doesn't feel safe to be that vulnerable with other people. So it can look like that. It can look a lot of different ways. But really, if you are expressing an emotion that you're feeling or sharing something personal about yourself and you're being criticized, belittled, invalidated for doing so, then your emotional boundaries are being violated by someone else. Yeah, it's a tough one to pin down. Are there any other things you want to say about it? I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, I know it's hard, isn't it? Once you think about it and then you try and think harder about it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I had two thoughts and only one of them is coming back to me in this moment. Let's see if the other one will show up.
Yeah, go with the first one. We'll see what happens.
Well, I was going to say another form of emotional boundary breaking, I would say, is gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where someone just denies your emotional reality. Right? They're just like, nope, I don't know what you're talking about. that isn't even a thing. Right? Or you're just crazy. Like only a crazy person would react that strongly. Like, not right. So, we could probably do a whole episode on what gaslighting is, so we won't go into it. Google it if you don't know the term. Because it's a long story based on a cool old movie. But, so I think gaslighting can be another way of doing that, of crossing emotional boundaries. And as for the other thought, I have no fucking idea what it was. Maybe it'll show up someday. I don't know. I will say, as an aside to everyone listening, and maybe to Michelle too, you, Michelle, have been a lot of lag and breaking up for me. So if occasionally I talk over you accidentally, or I seem like I have too much of a pause, I think our internet connection is not great.
Yeah, you paused for me just now while you were talking, and I couldn't hear what you were saying. So I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna let it.
Yeah,
keep
I've definitely missed a couple of things that you've said. So,
I think recording virtually.
I know it's so much fun. It's better now with the better equipment, but you still have to rely on the internet, and
yes,
that's dodgy these days. Maybe I'll remember what the other thing was, in which case I'll just burst out with it later. But I can't recall in the moment. It's just if someone is using your emotions against you, or telling you that
telling
they're
you
dumb.
your emotions are wrong, telling you
Oh,
you
that was
shouldn't
it.
feel what you feel. Oh, I helped remind you.
Yes, you were talking about this isn't someone saying they don't have the space for your emotions. And I was just going to double down on how awesome that is, right? To be able to do and to be able to hear, right? Like, it's to set a healthy emotional boundary. If, if a friend's coming to you and they're like, I've had the worst day and I need to unload, if you're at the top of your limits for the day, like a healthy boundary might look like, I'm so sorry, I'd love to talk to you about it tomorrow, or why didn't you send me an email that I can look at later, but I'm just overwhelmed right now and I can't take on the weight of your emotions right now, right? It's not screw you and your emotions, it's I can't do that right now. And so being able to both do that and hear that, I think, is a really hard, but wonderful thing to be able to do for emotional boundaries. So I just thought that was great that you brought that up, and I wanted to emphasize it.
Yeah,
I thought it meant.
Yeah, because I think it's something where, I definitely don't want it to be that moving forward after hearing us talk about this, that then people have some kind of expectation that anytime that somebody, can't or doesn't have the capacity to listen to them express themselves emotionally, that their boundaries are being stomped on, because that's not it at all. When your emotional boundaries are being violated, it normally shows up as somebody saying something to you in response, again, that is more or less criticizing the emotions that you're feeling. But if somebody's saying, basically, I'm not able to be here for you right now, that is them setting their own healthy boundary for their emotions. I liked how you put it that way. And that is not them violating your emotional boundaries. People can't be there for us all the time as much as we would like for them to be, but it's being able to tell the difference between, someone is not able to be here for me right now, versus somebody actively doesn't want to be here for me now.
Say someone just shitting on you for the need. Maybe that's the difference. So one is not you're bad for needing. That one is I understand why you need me, but I can't be there. And the other one, I think the actual violation is don't need me. You're stop it.
Yep. Don't need me. Don't feel what you're feeling.
Yep. Yeah.
All of that.
Yep. The other one is what you're doing is valid. I just can't be here for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The other one is what you're doing is invalid. Maybe that's the nuance there.
Nice.
All right, on to my favorite topic.
Yes, go for it, Kate. I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
I know. Oh, man.
No pressure.
No pressure. So, let's see. Ugh, where to start? Too many thoughts at once. 8 want to come out of my mouth. But only one at a time is allowed.
What are sexual boundaries, Kate?
Well, I guess I love that the thing on the handout says this, because I do think it is incredibly under-recognized, right? When we think about sexual boundaries, most of us think of the physical aspects of sexuality, right? So this is being touched in places or ways that we don't want to, engaging in sexual acts that we aren't comfortable with, or with people we don't want to, right? This idea of contact between bodies, in some fashion or another. And while absolutely that is a huge and important facet of sexual boundaries, sexuality encompasses so much more. Right? There's an emotional and an intellectual, and they don't mention this, but I would even say social, like ideas of what sexuality is. And those are also places that you can be violated. Some that it mentions here, like catcalling or leering, right, is a way that people can violate someone else's sexual boundaries without touching them. Sexual commentary, right? I think about the super stereotypical, like, I don't know, male coworker telling you your tits look good in that, right? Like, didn't touch you, still violated a sexual boundary, right? So this is who is interacting with you, with your sexuality, and in what way, right? And there's so many ways to interact with your sexuality. I would say, personally, that hate speech around people's sexual orientations counts as a way of violating someone's sexual boundaries, right? That is violence against an aspect of my sexuality, right? So I guess this is a really long-winded way of saying, remember that we as sexual beings encompass so much more than just our bodies, right? Our brains, our hearts, our communities are also involved in our sexuality. So that's one big sort of overarching idea, right? And so because of that, ways that sexual boundaries can be violated also include things like pressure around sex, right? That before any touching is involved, someone pushing you towards, any sex or specific sexual acts that you're not interested in or, don't believe and don't want to do for any reason, right? Or just as we were talking about the commentary or, even looking at you, right? I don't know. It's hard to describe being leered at, but if you've been leered at, you know what being leered at is.
Just being like looked up and down.
Yeah, ogled, someone staring.
Yeah.
I came equipped with breasts into this world. And so people talking to them and not you. like I understand they can be distracting for me as well, but I would prefer eye contact. It's like, I don't know as much as what it is for people who came equipped with other bodies. But right, being looked at as though you are only a sex object and not a person where sexuality happens to be an aspect of who and what you are. So around sexuality, one of the things that I think is the most important concepts, of course, is this concept of consent, right? And for that, there's been, so many different things. If you haven't ever looked up, I guess you could just Google consent and tea, as in like drinking tea, TEA. If you've never seen the video put out by, I think, the British government. Anyway, it's amazing. It's so worthwhile. I might try and get Michelle to post a link to it in the Facebook page because it's wonderful. It's like if someone tells you they want a cup of tea, but then while you're making the tea, they fall asleep, you don't walk into the room and just pour tea down their throat. If someone's asleep, they don't want tea. So in this, tea is a metaphor for sex through the whole video, and it's amazing. But also, Planned Parenthood actually came up with an acronym, and I thought, how appropriate on a DBT podcast to include something that's an acronym, because where would we be without acronyms if we were doing DBT? So their acronym for consent is the word fries. Yes, like French fries, eating them, right? So in their way of putting it, consent is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. So I would say this is a wonderful place to practice stuff, right? This is something to keep in mind for yourself. There's so much socialization around things like, I don't know, well, I led them on, right? Or, well, we're already having sex, I can't say stop now.
Yeah, I said yes at first, and then I didn't, I was
uncomfortable.
Change my mind. Or,
or, someone said, can I have sex with you? And you said yes, imagining sexual act A. And then they begin to engage with you in sexual act B. And you're like, well, haha, hang on a moment. I don't know, not that orifice. I don't know, right? Like there's all sorts of things. That's why specific is so important, right? So can I touch you is a very different question than can I touch your breasts? Right? These are not equivalent statements. So, right, just being one of the best, I guess, what's the right word I'm looking for? Weapons against consent violations or against boundary violations with regards to sexuality is, and I cannot emphasize this enough, conversation. Talk about stuff. Because I guarantee you, I don't know how many people are listening to this right now, but none of you mean the same thing by the word sex. Not a goddamn one of you. I promise it. It's just not true. Nobody means the same thing. Seems like a short, little, simple, honest to goodness, easygoing word, and it's not. No one means the same thing, right? So being willing and able to have open and honest communications with potential sexual partners or with people who are not and are never going to be sexual partners is also a thing they probably need to know. Is the best antidote towards either violating other people's sexual boundaries yourself, right? I guess I want to look at all of these different boundaries, both from the how to set them yourself and how to be cautious around violating others, right? And so the more informed you are about someone else, the less likely you are to accidentally cross their boundaries. And the more you are open and honest and converse with your potential people, the less likely they are to cross yours. And I think that that's a super, important facet to focus on, is this idea of information. And I don't want to put this, some people are grossly, what's the word I'm looking for? Guilty of deliberate, horrible sexual boundary violations, right? Rape, etc. And there's a continuum, and sometimes you or others might accidentally cross boundaries. And that's another thing that conversation can help recover from, right? So yeah, what sexual boundaries are around your emotional truth around sex, what sex does or does not mean to you emotionally, who you are and are not willing to have it with, what contexts you are willing to have it with, your intellectual boundaries around sex, what is interesting, what is uninteresting, what are you willing to talk about, what are you unwilling to talk about, when do you believe people should talk about sex, when do children get taught about sex, right? There's all this intellectual stuff around it, and then also the more obvious physical aspects of sexuality. Who gets to touch me, where, when, how, for how long, and in what situations, right? Maybe I'm perfectly comfortable having sex in my bedroom, but if anybody ever suggested having sex in the movie theater, that's like, what even is wrong with you? I don't know, right? Like, this is not my opinions, but I know there's varied, right? So remember that it's more than just what happens between two bodies. Sexual boundaries are about what is happening between two people. Huh! All of that rambling, and that's the sentence I was looking for the entire time. There we go.
Kate, I love it. I love everything you said.
Took me a while to get there, but
no, it was great. And I think it's something that I was reflecting on as you were talking, because I grew up going to a very small private Christian school until 8th grade. I think I might have shared that on a previous episode at some point. Mm-hmm. But basically, I did not receive any sex ed throughout elementary or middle school. It was just kind of, and I think it is this way for a lot of people. Sex is just something that you don't talk about. People have a lot of rigid boundaries around sex. And again, as you pointed out really nicely, not even just the physical act of sexual touching in any kind of way, but just the talking about it. Mm-hmm. A lot of people just don't. So that's a rigid boundary. Like, you're not talking about it at all. And what kind of a message is that sending? For a lot of people, when it comes to sexual boundaries, that creates a lot of feelings of shame. Yeah. When they do want to talk about sex, learn about sex, engage in sexual activities, whatever it is, there could be so much shame that comes up around that because they have just not been taught any sexual boundaries. They've just been taught, let's ignore that, more or less. So I really appreciate dragons. Yeah. So it's something that, growing up in kind of a social environment at school where that was kind of the, what no one talked about that. It's one of those things that can take a long time once you get into adulthood to feel comfortable with some of the things that you were just talking about being able to have open conversations with partners and knowing what you like and feel comfortable with and what you don't like and don't feel comfortable with. And with sexual boundaries, I think for a lot of people that, I don't like to put it this way, but it's a lot of trial and error. Like, you don't know until something's happening, and then it's like, oh wait, no, not that. Not that. And being able to speak up about that. So nice work. I did think all of it, Kate.
Of one other thing. I don't know why I didn't think about it before, but kinks.
Mm-hmm.
are a great place where emotional and intellectual stuff comes to play. Because a lot of people are very shamed either by culture, by their family, by their partners, just for having an interest in something. Like someone can violate your sexual boundaries just by shaming you for an interest, for a curiosity. You may never have engaged in the thing. And people are already telling you you're disgusting, you're sick, you're broken, you're whatever, right? So I often think of kinks as whatever you're not into. No one, it takes a while before someone thinks of themselves as kinky. Most of the time, like, well, this is all normal because this is all the stuff I'm interested and willing to engage in. But that stuff over there that I'm not interested in, that's some kinky shit, right? This idea of where your own interests are. But I would say that both for yourself, recognize that if people are treating you that way around your sexual curiosities and interests, that may be someone to have more rigid boundaries with, as a polite way of putting it. But also be aware of that in yourself, right? If a family member, friend, sexual partner, or whatever is like, I've always wondered about, fill in the blank here, try not to shame them. Try and recognize that that is just as tender and personal of a sexual space as any actual sex act. So I guess my last thought there.
Amazing stuff, Kate. Very good. All right. So we're going to move on to talking about material boundaries. So when we say material boundaries, what that really means is boundaries around money and boundaries around objects, things, possessions, items that are yours. How do you have boundaries with that? So kind of brings me back to, I don't know, being a kid, and it just would feel like you'd share everything with everyone. Like, I remember in elementary school, we'd all bring this stuff to school, and then we just all share back and forth. But then sometimes someone wouldn't give you your toy back or whatever it was. It's like, wait, hold on a minute. By the end of the day, I'm supposed to have that back. That's mine, It's kind of a silly example, but that's the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about material boundaries. Was, I had a few close friends that we had very porous material boundaries with each other growing up, We would share everything with one another. And then, in adulthood, I feel like the biggest way that this shows up is with money, loaning people money. And this can be a big boundary violation, and how do we handle that when we loan someone money and they don't pay us back? What do we do? And I've had that happen. I have had it happen before where I loaned someone money and I didn't get it back. And it is something that leaves a mark on the relationship when you and that other person discussed how much money you are going to give them and when and how you expect it to be paid back, and you're not. So this can show up in a lot of different ways. This can show up in loaning some possession to someone. And again, you talk about when you're going to get it back, what they're going to use that for. Maybe they accidentally break it or don't treat it how you expected them to, or how the two of you agreed to originally, but then that doesn't end up being what happens. So that can be a boundary violation there. It also says here on the sheet, stealing something. Woo, yeah, that's a huge material boundary violation. Yeah, it says steals.
I was like,
when someone steals or
damages
damages another person's possession, or when they pressure them to give or lend them their possessions, right? This can be another common thing, I feel like, around money. Excuse me, someone being like, come on, it's only $20. It's only $20. Like, I'll pay you back. It's fine. I know you have the money. Like, why can't you give it to me? Those kinds of things are all boundary violations when it comes to this material boundary setting. So this is one that I feel like can become very complex, because it's figuring out what you are okay with other people having, either permanently or temporarily, what you are okay with other people having, the relationship you have with that person, the context of loaning or giving this thing to them, and how to handle it if this agreement does not come to be how the two of you originally anticipated it. I think sometimes material boundaries are also one of those things that we think are pretty unspoken, but are not always. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but my mother-in-law lives with me and my husband. And we have told her time and time again, if we buy food, like groceries for the household, she can eat whatever food she wants that we buy for us, that she can eat it. That's okay. And she will not eat the food that we buy. She's just kind of like, no, I can't eat that because you guys bought it. We're like, we've told you it's fine, that kind of a thing. But to her, it seems so obvious that she didn't spend her money on that food. She will not eat it. And we're like, no, you can. It's totally fine. So different people have different ideas. Or I hear about this sometimes with, like, I don't know, sisters growing up. I don't have a sister. Kate, you do. So I don't know if this ever applied with you and Kelly. But, like, you know, just one person walking into the other person's closet and just, like, taking their clothes. I don't think you guys were necessarily close enough age for that.
I'm 5'8". My sister's 5'2". I have a big chest. She has a tiny, like, no,
yeah,
we could not.
I don't know if it would apply to the two of you.
I have size 10 feet. She has size 7.5.
Yeah, maybe one worked so well.
And she's 11 years older, right? So there's all sorts of complications.
Yeah, all sorts of complications. I was like, well, you have a sister, but maybe not. But, like, they don't view it as any big, you know, one person walks into the other person's closet and, you know, takes their jeans, and the other person's like, why'd you take my clothes? The other person's like, I didn't think it would be a big deal. So some material boundaries, people think, it's either not a big deal or it can really be a big violation when somebody takes our things or uses something without our permission. So thinking for yourself around what kinds of material boundaries you have. Again, I know lots of people, and to be honest, I've kind of become this way. I don't really loan people money anymore. Doesn't matter how well I know you, how much money it is. Probably not going to happen. But, you know, some people are very giving and have very porous boundaries with what they let other people use or have, or just what they give to them. And then other people can be pretty closed off. But a lot of it depends on what the thing is that you are considering sharing with this other person and what the nature of your relationship is with that person. How much trust is there between the two of you? So yeah, it can be very nuanced with material boundaries, because you may loan one person $20 and not another person for various reasons. So it can be complicated, but that's what we're meaning with material boundaries is, you know,
stuff and money.
Yeah, exactly. What you do with your stuff and your money. Yep.
I also think a bit about, like, not just like the what, but the how. I think you touched on this a little bit, but oddly enough, you think about, like, I don't know, childhood and stuff like that. When I think about material boundaries, for some reason, the first thing I think about is cars. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, first of all, like, I'm very particular about who I would allow to drive my car, right? Mm-hmm. Like, at all. But then also I can imagine if I'm like, yeah, you can borrow my car to go do this thing, and then someone brings it back, but they, like, there's, like, I don't know, McDonald's trash in the car, and they left the radio on, blaring on the gross fill in the blank here with music you hate channel. Like, you know, like, there's ways you're like, well, I mean, I was okay with using my car, but, like, dude. Yep. So that's another place where conversation and specificity can be very helpful. Yes, you can borrow the car, but bring it back like you found it.
Yes, please don't eat food in it.
Yeah.
Please leave the radio as it currently is. Whatever it is. Yeah.
Right? Like, whatever those things are. Yep. Yeah, so that's just an idea. Otherwise, I think you covered that lovely.
Thanks.
Well, not otherwise. I do think you covered that lovely. I just think it's funny because I think about cars. That's what I think. I'm like, which is hilarious because my car is trash, and yet I wouldn't be you can trash your car, but no one else is allowed to.
Yep.
Last but in no amount least, is I'm going to talk about time boundaries. This one is interesting. There's so many different, I don't know. I think there's time boundaries you set with yourself, which is one I think a lot of people struggle with. In fact, maybe, I hadn't even thought about this. All of these, we can set our boundaries with ourselves. Michelle.
Mm-hmm. Surprise.
Surprise! All right, anyway, sorry. That was just my mind-blown moment, apparently, for the day. Anyway, time boundaries, right? So this is how do you spend your time, and how do other people interact with your time, right? So part of this can be like work-life balance. That's probably a phrase that you hear a lot, and that's about time boundaries, right? Are you allocating a reasonable amount of time to different facets of your life, work, relationships, hobbies, chores, whatever, right? Are each of them getting the amount of time they need and or deserve? And if they're not, is that you? Right? Are you not setting good time boundaries for yourself? You're not protecting the things that need protecting. So, like, oh, I told my family I would spend this whole weekend with them, but then work asked me if I could do overtime. And, I said yes. And now my wife and kids are mad at me. I don't know, whatever. So like, are you not holding boundaries around how you spend your time? Either against the, requests of others, or just, I don't know, you're entirely in charge of it. I do think I've shared this with Michelle. I don't think I've shared this on here before, but early on in my time in private practice, I was complaining about how my schedule looked one day. And I was complaining about it to a friend and colleague who is also in private practice. And she looked at me and absolute deadpan just said, "Wow, your boss is a dick." And I was like, oh.
I'm my own boss.
I'm my own boss. If I have a terrible schedule, there is literally no one to blame but myself. And that's like become a mantra for me, oddly, in my whole life as running my own practice and my own business is, your boss is a dick. Thankfully, I'm not a dick boss very often anymore, but I struggled with that for a while, right? This idea of you ought to help everybody, you should be there anytime your client wants you, take on as many people as you can fit, sort of the money, like there was all sorts of ways that I pressured myself and was a dick boss for a period of time, and I still have to fight against it some, but I've gotten better. But the other ways that time boundaries can be violated are explicitly from another person. So is someone just demanding way too much of your time? Right? And this could be bosses, boss at work. This could be your spouse or partner. This could be a friend who's in, constant need. There's all sorts of different relationships in which someone can just keep making these asks or demands constantly of another person until they are eating up a disproportionate amount of the time that you have in your life. That is one way that other people can violate your time boundaries. Another one that I have relaxed an amount around in life, but is people being late, right? There's a difference between, 5 to 15 minutes late and an hour and 15 minutes late, right? If someone has agreed to meet you at a certain time and place and then they're an hour or two late, that is a violation of your time boundaries, right? There were expectations set and, boundaries set around something, and this person is just whatever around, they're disrespecting the agreement that they made and your time, right? Which whether, however you want to think of it, your time is valuable, right? And if someone is disrespecting the value of that, that is one way that they can violate your time boundaries. So I don't know. I don't have too much else, I think, to say about that one other than try and remember both to look at and set and maintain your own internal boundaries. Like, I don't know. Sure, I would love to stay up until 3 a.m. playing this video game, but I know I have work tomorrow, so I need to, respect my own boundary around going to bed at a reasonable time on work nights. Right? That's a boundary I've set for myself, and I need to respect and maintain that in order to keep feeling, healthy and balanced. Or, with us all working from home these days, not all, I know a lot of people are out and doing amazing things, but a lot of people are working from home right now, and being like, all right, even though I'm home, I'm still shutting down the computer at 5 p.m. Like, I'm done. Right? Just because it's so easily accessible doesn't mean it gets to eat into the time I have set aside for me or my family or whatever. So yeah, there's the internal boundaries that you have and set for yourself and maintain for yourself, and really other people don't interact with much at all. And then there is, what are people demanding of you for how you spend your time, where you spend your time, and are they respecting your time and how they interact with it? Are they being late, or are they leaving early, or are they not things like that. Any other thoughts to add there, Michelle?
I think you did a really good job explaining it and gave a lot of different examples for how this can look. For me personally, out of all 6, this is my biggest boundary struggle because I can have very porous boundaries with time. In the sense of I struggle to tell people no, that I'm too busy. I just kind of take more and more on until I don't have any time left for myself or other things that I want to do. And this is something that I've struggled with other people. You know, if I do try to, or within, you know, my family, there is kind of that expectation of you always make time for each other. And so if you are saying, you know, if my parents want me to come over for a certain gathering or a certain event, and if I'm saying, you know, basically I don't think I'll have the time, or I have this other thing scheduled, sometimes there's this expectation of, oh, well, you're supposed to reschedule that for us, or that kind of a thing. So it's something that I've really struggled with personally. That's still a work in progress for me. So just hearing you talk about the time boundaries, I don't really have much more to add other than
it's hard.
Yeah, it hits home.
Yeah.
And I really like that they included that on this list as its own distinct thing, because I think it's one of the boundaries that people might not typically
remember.
So yeah. So, I like it. All right, so now that we have talked to you all about rigid, porous, and healthy boundaries and the 6 different types of boundaries that there are, now comes the $1 million question of, well, okay, that's cool. That's cool to know about the different types of boundaries and all of that, and whether I have rigid, porous, or healthy boundaries, and also how do I set boundaries? How do I set them? And again, really the only skill that DBT has to address this is FAST. So FAST can and does do a really nice job of giving you some things to think about when you're setting boundaries and making sure that you are being fair and not apologizing and sticking to your values and being truthful and all of that. That's really important. So FAST plays a key role in this. But what else? So Kay and I are going to each share just some other things that we recommend when it comes to how to set boundaries and things that we tell our clients basically that we're going to share with all of you. And it's also probably important to note as well before we get into this is that so much of this is going to be really unique to different circumstances and different people in your lives, right? Setting a boundary with a coworker is going to be very different than setting a boundary with your sister, you know, because those are different relationships, and you may be setting a different type of boundary with each one. Maybe you need better time boundaries at work, but you need better material boundaries with your friends or whatever it is. So this is really general tips that we're going to give. So one of the first things that I want to say is that when it comes to setting boundaries, it's really important to practice saying the word no. And you may be like, okay, that sounds really simple. And also, if you really take a good look at your life, my guess is you're probably not saying the word no very often. I don't say the word no very often. This has been a work in progress for me. If Kate were to call me up and if she were to, you know, non-COVID times, if she were to be like, hey, Michelle, want to come over to my house? And blah, 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 blah. I probably would just say, I can't. I'm really busy. I'm sorry. I'm not saying the word no. I'm telling her no, but I'm not saying the word no. And we do this exercise in in-person groups when we do the interpersonal effectiveness module. We tell people to say the word stop. We have them do this exercise where they progressively walk closer to each other, and then one person gets to say the word stop when the other is getting too close. And so many people don't actually say the word stop. They go, I'm good. Or they say, okay, that's enough. All right. You know, they say that. They don't say stop. And we don't say the word no very often. And again, I'm not saying to just say no, right? Kate calls me up, Michelle, come over. No.
Click.
Right. Not that. But to say, no, I have some other plans going on. You know, it's important to say that because we hear the word no differently than we do other variations of saying no to someone. So practice saying the word no to people. This can be done in a firm, respectful, kind way, but practice saying the actual word no, because chances are you're not saying it very often. So that's one way to practice setting boundaries, is to do that more often. And the other thing, you know, we talked about this a little bit with Dear Man, that you can Dear Man situations that are pretty low stakes. I recommend that with boundaries too. I think in general, with a lot of what we talked about today, I'll talk about this a little bit with homework, but it could be really helpful for you to think about all 6 of the different types of boundaries that we discussed, and to really mull over and reflect and think about whether you have rigid, porous, or healthy boundaries in each of those 6 areas. What it looks like with different people, where it's easy for you to set boundaries and where it's harder for you to set boundaries, and to start making an effort to practice creating healthy boundaries with people in your life that might be easier for you to do that with. Like if you recognize, oh yeah, you know, that one friend and I, we don't really have very good intellectual boundaries, but I really think I could probably talk to them about that, and they're probably a person who would maybe listen to me, and we can try to do better because we have good emotional boundaries. So maybe I'll try that or something, you know, saying, hey, would we start talking about politics? This is what I see going on, and whatever it is. So try to pick people in your life that you want to maybe do some tuning up with the boundaries that you have with them. The toughest people, in my opinion, to set boundaries with are family members and bosses. Lots of people, though, can be hard. You may have one friend that you're like, oh my God, I'm not touching that. Like, you know, setting boundaries with her is going to be really hard, or whatever it is.
Spouses can be really hard, too.
Yeah, romantic partners can be very hard.
Sorry, yes, all romantic partners. I just happen to have a spouse, so I think of that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I got one of those, too. But yeah, just generally speaking, like someone you're in a romantic relationship with, that can also be tough to set boundaries with. So it's gonna vary and be unique, but don't aim too high right away with trying to set some boundaries. Dear Man can also be a form of boundary setting when you're trying to ask this person for something that you would want to be different in your relationship. Use your Dear Man skills to do that. But again, you can start off with people that are lower stakes and be really clear on what boundary of yours is being violated and what you would like instead from this person. That doesn't mean that person is going to change, even if you do an amazing job using FAST and using Dear Man and using whatever else you have in your toolkit to say what you would like. That doesn't mean they're going to change overnight, but then you get to have a decision of how you want to respond to that, and if you need to take a step back from that relationship if this person isn't going to respect the boundaries that you have for yourself. So I'm hoping this makes sense, because I feel like I'm sharing a lot. But first thing I recommend is reflecting on what boundaries in your life could use some work, who you feel safe to start doing that work with, and saying the word no more often, and using FAST and Dear Man. So there's a lot.
There is a lot.
Go, Kate, share your thoughts now.
Oh my gosh. All right, so you covered a lot of stuff. What else do I have to add on? You were just talking about start with easy people. I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I will share from my personal experience that I fucking love it when clients set boundaries with me.
Oh my God.
It's so awesome. So I'm like, hey, I thought I don't know, we'll just pull shit out of a hat. I don't know. I thought we'd tackle your sexual trauma today. And if they're like, no, I'm not up for that today. I'm like, okay, cool. right? I feel so trusted and proud of them and excited in so many levels. So for those of you, if you have a therapist out there, I'd say that might be a nice place to start, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that can be a safe place. Anyway, that just follows your like start where it's easy. Because I love it. I'm always so excited when my clients tell me no. They don't want to do something. Makes me great. Another idea that I have is applying a lot. Well, so at least in the communities in which I move personally and which I tend to serve as a therapist, the term enthusiastic consent is something that's talked about a lot, specifically for sexual boundaries, right? This idea that if you're lukewarm about something, stick with no, right? That only do the things that you're like, hell yeah, about, right? And having that as a bar, both for you saying yes to things that are being asked of you, and, you know, if you notice that you're asking something of someone else and they're like, okay. You're like, well, you know, maybe not. You know, I'm looking for hell yeses, not I guess so's. Right?
Yeah.
So, but I really love applying this same concept of enthusiastic consent to more or less everything. Now, bless your heart if you're someone who has a life in which you never have to do anything you're not enthusiastic about. I think that's rare. So, right, you're probably going to have to do some work tasks you're not enthusiastically
Chores
consenting
around the
to.
house.
Chores, exactly, right. But on
With
average,
other people.
yeah, with other people, when people are asking you things, like really look at yourself and only say yes if it's a hell yes. Now, grant you, I think it's good to inform the people in your life you're doing this. Hey, I'm working on setting boundaries. So, you might hear me say no to a lot more things as I work this out in practice. Right? Like, it's not you. I don't hate you guys. I'm just learning how to do this. Right? Which, by the way, no shame for those of you who are learning how to do this. I count myself in that camp. I mean, there are some that I'm better, some that I'm worse, but I am not done learning how to set boundaries and maintain them, right? So, enthusiastic consent, right? Take a span of time and just put a really fucking high bar in your life for saying yes. You can adjust it later as needed. Maybe that feels so good to you that you want to leave it there for the rest of time. That's fine. Maybe you're like, that was exhausting and hard. I'm glad I had the practice, but now I can bring that down a little bit, right? It's okay to include some things that feel obligatory, or, you know, like we can fudge it, right? We can move it around, but take some time where you only say yes when it's a hell yes. And I think that dovetails in really well because that's a great time to do Michelle's practicing saying the word no. Because if you apply enthusiastic consent to everything, you're going to be saying no to a lot more stuff.
This is true.
Otherwise, I was just thinking about, like, I don't know, a very literal how to set boundaries. Obviously, as Michelle was saying, we can't say enough about how every situation is going to be unique. So this is generalized, but may not be applicable. I think of things like being gentle but firm. Right? Don't laugh while you're setting a boundary or giggle. Don't use weak language. Like, I don't know, but I guess, or so, right? Like, you don't have to be mean. You don't have to be insulting. You don't have to be loud or angry. So that's where I think of as the gentle, right? It's not about softening it to like, I don't know, like simpering or begging or things, but just, not aggressive. You don't have to necessarily, ideally, you don't have to be aggressive, but you do need to be firm, right? So, I don't know if I was like, Michelle, come down to visit me. And she was like, no, I'm busy. If I were like, oh, but you haven't come down here in ages. Come on. I'm sure whatever else you're doing can wait. Coming down and visit me. Right? Michelle, ideally setting firm boundaries, was like, Kate, the answer is no. I'm really not, I really can't do that this weekend. Right? She doesn't have to be a dick, but she remains firm in it, right? The other thing I think of is repeat as needed, right? Sort of in that little fake role play. Yeah, it's broken record, right? Just, no, I'm not doing that thing. I also think that it can be very helpful to literally use the term boundary, right? If someone seems to be having a really hard time understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, something like that, it can help to break through to people, to be like, this is really a boundary that I've set for myself, or this is a boundary that I've realized I need to set in my relationships, or, right, literally talking about a thing as a boundary can sometimes perk people's ears up to, oh, this isn't just a preference, or this isn't just, this person being a dick. This isn't just, right, like, sometimes with some people, I would say the more reasonable people that you might be struggling with, if you're like, this is really a boundary of mine, or a boundary I need to set, or things like that. If you use the term boundary, I do think people are more likely to, I don't know, clue in to what's actually being talked about, if that makes sense. I definitely agree with Michelle's idea of practicing with people who are easier, ramp up to the really difficult stuff, and be so nice to yourself when you fuck it up.
Oh, yeah.
Be so nice. Be so nice. Because you're gonna. Right? Just pull absolutely no punches. You are absolutely gonna fuck this up. So, just expect it and be kind to yourself. Last thought around that was the idea of receiving it, because I know I mentioned that at the very beginning. I'd say if you're going in to make requests of people, like if something feels high stakes, if you're really afraid of rejection, if you've, bumped into this boundary with someone before and you're afraid to, approach it again, even if they said maybe later, but it's still a nerve-wracking thing. I would recommend kind of like, and we're going to do the opposite of this in the closing moment, so maybe that's a way to help you kind of visualize it as well. But kind of walk yourself through the situation and do a cope ahead kind of idea with it. Like, all right, if this person says no to me again about this, how will I respond? Like, what do I want to say so that I make sure I'm being respectful of them, setting their boundaries? But then afterwards, how can I soothe myself, like, emotionally? What can I do to take care of the fact that it doesn't always feel good to be on the other side of a boundary that someone set? That can feel embarrassing, that can feel hurtful, that can feel scary. Did I already say embarrassing?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, there's so many, like, I literally forgot my own sentence. Right, so how can you soothe yourself, right? If you're like, every time that somebody tells me no or sets a boundary with me, my first instinct is to run away and never talk to them again. You'd be like, all right, this is my plan. I'm going to text message them 2 days after it happened, and, to make sure that I don't drop the relationship like a red hot coal because I'm freaked out about someone saying no to me. And so kind of have a game plan going into it. If you know that you're particularly sensitive to, either because of the situation or just who you are as a person, to, being on the receiving end of boundary setting. It can be good to prepare yourself. And again, be gentle, be kind to yourself. It is hard. It's hard to hear no. It's hard to hear no and not think that it's because the person hates you. It's hard to hear no and not think that, all sorts of negative, nasty things. So, yeah. What's our homework, Michelle?
Yeah, so for homework, I mentioned it a little bit a little bit ago. Oh boy.
Our brains are fried today.
Our brains are fried today. It's all good though. But basically, I would encourage you guys as a good starting point to think back on the 6 different types of boundaries we talked about. So let's see if I can do it off the top of my head. Physical,
right, I'm
intellectual,
yep.
Emotional, sexual, material, and time.
Woo!
I did look at the worksheet when I did that. Woohoo! I'm paying attention.
Nice job.
So think back on those 6 different types of boundaries, and if there are 1 or 2 that you really struggle with. So for me, my biggest struggle is time boundaries. But think about it for yourself. What are 1 or 2 areas that you really struggle with? And to spend some time reflecting or journaling, if you like to journal, about what makes it hard for you to set boundaries in those areas. What examples do you see yourself doing where you're having maybe really porous boundaries or too rigid boundaries or whatever it is? Just reflecting on, like, where do I need some work? That would be great homework to do this week. If you want to, you can absolutely start setting boundaries with some of the strategies that Kate and I just discussed. You can absolutely do that this week as well. But if part of you is just kind of like, I don't know if I'm really ready to start setting boundaries with people in my life yet, that's totally fine. Just do some further thinking about it for yourself. Talk about it with your therapist if you have a therapist. That is doing the work. Even if you are not doing it yet with another person, you are still doing the work to change the way that you create boundaries for yourself.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, so for awkward self-promotion,
Woo!
so this week for our Patreon shout out, the person we are shouting out is Devin. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Devan? I'm gonna go with Devin. Anyway.
Thank you, Devin.
Thank you, Devin. You know who you are. Thank you for being a loyal patron. I feel bad when we get people donating and then I see their names. I'm like, uh-oh, I think I know how to say it. I'm pretty sure I know how to say it. But thank you. Thank you for being a patron. If you want to become a patron like Devin, go to patreon.com/dbtandme. And you can donate and contribute to our Patreon. If you want to check out our Etsy shop and see the cool shirts and stuff that we have on there and other items, go to etsy.com and search for DBT and me, just all one word, and you'll find our shop. Also, give us a rating or write us a review on Apple Podcasts. And finally, send us emails if you have any questions to ask, things you're curious about, just stuff you want to share with us. dbtandmepodcast@gmail.com is where you can do that. Okay.
Perfect.
Closing moment.
Closing moment.
Yeah, let's do it.
Jinx. Okay. I like it. I always take that big sigh first. I settle into it as much as anybody else does. Okay. As per usual, start by just getting comfy. Whatever that means for you in the setting and you're in right now or how your body's feeling. You could sit down, lay down, stand, walk, whatever feels good. Just get yourself into a position or a posture that you can maintain and be comfortable in. Also, if you feel safe and comfortable doing so, I invite you to go ahead and close your eyes. To begin with, we're just going to tune into our breathing. You don't have to breathe any more deeply or any more slowly than you are naturally. It's just about paying attention. Just about following our breath into and back out of our lungs, allowing the rhythm of our breath to bring us into our bodies and into the present moment. So for today, we're going to work on coping ahead a little bit with the idea of setting a boundary. As we've been talking about in the episode, this can be something that is scary, and it's stressful. It's just plain hard. So before we tackle it out there in the big wide world, let's have a practice run inside our own minds. So I'd like you to take a moment, think back on all the different boundaries that Michelle and I have been talking about, and think about one place where you're like, oh, yeah, I need to do that with this person in my life. And just imagine that whole scenario. Take these next few seconds to picture that person, to bring to mind that situation, either something you're looking at in the future or something that comes up repeatedly with this person. Just really let the situation and the person, whatever emotions you're feeling around it, really settle into your body and your mind and your imagination right now. And once you have that pretty firmly held in your mind, I'd like you to go ahead and imagine setting this needed boundary with this person. What might you say? Where might you choose to do it? What setting would you like to be in? How might this person respond? Give yourself a moment to think of both maybe a best and a worst case scenario. Imagine what it might feel like in your body as you set this boundary. What do you feel? Where do you feel it? And we're just building this whole scenario in our head as clearly as we can. the most important thing about this whole imagination exercise is that you imagine you doing your part well. Think of it as a dress rehearsal. Right now, in your imagination, there's no pressure. Nothing can actually go wrong. So use the power of your imagination and really picture yourself now hitting this one out of the park. Imagine yourself doing it smoothly, with as much confidence as you can muster. Imagine what your posture might be, your tone of voice, your word choice. But let you do your part well. Again, if you want to take the time to imagine how you'd respond if that person responds ideally, and maybe how differently you might respond if that person instead responds really poorly. But in all of it, no matter how the other participant responds, I want you to focus the most on you doing your part really well and how that feels. Right? As we rehearse, imagine things in our mind, they do become easier in real life. If you're going to sort of cope ahead with a boundary setting situation in your life, don't imagine yourself doing it poorly, because then that's what you're rehearsing, that's what you're practicing, and it makes it more likely to go that way. Instead, in the safety of your own mind, where you have the power to direct how it all goes, do it well. Feel it going well. And give yourself that leg up for when you actually encounter it in the real world. Now, I know that situations like this could be complicated, could be long, and maybe you're not done with imagining by the time I'm going to wrap up here in a moment. So, unlike most of the time, I will say, if you want to keep going with this after we're done here today, just keep going for as long as you need to. Go through as many different scenarios as you need to feel comfortable. Go through it as many times as you need to. Give yourself the leeway to give this the time and effort and thought that it deserves. But if you are ready, if you have done this practicing, go ahead and start coming back into your body, into your room, wherever you may be. Go ahead and roll your neck or shoulders, stretch your body in any way that feels good to it. Maybe take a couple of deep breaths. And whenever you're ready to, go ahead and let go of what you formed in your imagination and go ahead and open your eyes. Thanks so much, everybody. Talk to you next week.